Hello, my name is Diane, and today I want to talk about all the books I read in January. This year I've been trying to focus my reading on the books that I own that I haven't read yet, the series that I'm currently reading that I want to either finish or get caught up on, and I'm also trying to get better at sticking to the TBRs that I set. I think it's really fun planning my reading and picking out the books I'm currently most excited to get to that I want to read in the next month. But generally, in the middle of the month, things start coming up. I kind of veer off track from that list, and usually it means I'm reading other things that I am really enjoying, but I would like to get better at making TBRs that I can finish, maybe have a little more wiggle room than I tend to leave myself, so when things do come up, it doesn't offset everything else that I was planning on reading that month. So I'm still figuring out what's a good amount of books to put on my TBR that still leaves me room to mood read or read new releases and things like that that come up that I maybe wasn't planning on. But first I want to take a look at what was on my January TBR, see how I did with those books, how many of them I actually got to read and how many of them I still have to get to at some point. And then I'll talk about all of the other things I read that I wasn't planning on reading. So first let's take a look at what was on my January TBR. First up was Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher. This follows a woman who has received an inheritance from her uncle, which unfortunately has caused a lot of problems for her involving the family. She decides that the best way to resolve this is to end her life, which she's not entirely sure how to go about, and when she unsheaths a sword in an attempt to do this, it releases a swordsman who has been magically contained within the sword. He agrees to help her solve her problems in a more productive way. They go on a pretty small adventure together and get to know one another. This is a fantasy romance, so they do develop a romance throughout the story. This is much more romance leaning than I generally prefer. I did read this book, I did enjoy it, but since it is a fantasy romance, it's more romance leaning than adventure, although I would say it's fairly balanced between plot and romance. It's still more romance than I like. I like more adventure, less relationships. So I do think this was a fun read. I did enjoy it. Definitely not a new favorite of mine just because of the genre, but I had a fun time with it. If you want a more low-stakes fantasy romance, I think this is a good way to go. Just isn't really the genre for me. Next up is Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo. This is the sequel to King of Scars, which I had been kind of disappointed in, and I decided I just don't want to finish this series. Once I got to the point where I was ready to pick it up, I just wasn't excited about it at all, so I ended up just crossing this off of my TBR and just calling it good. I'm probably not going to finish this series, maybe someday in the future. My interest for it will come back, but I'm just not very excited in seeing how this duology ends. Even though it is just a duology, I could just read this book and call it done, but I'd rather just not read it. I'd rather read other things instead. So I ended up taking this off of my TBR. Did not read it. Didn't even try. Next is The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. This is one of my owned books. I read about 200 pages of it. I don't even know when. It's been a while. And then set it down in favor of other things, which is a problem I tend to have with books I own because they're right there and I can read them whenever, so I don't prioritize them. I did not make any more progress on this one last month, so even though I didn't make any more progress on this book, I am hopefully going to get to it in the next few weeks. Then I have The Vagrant by Peter Newman. This is another one that I own and I started and then I set it down in favor of other things that I didn't own and just never picked it back up. I also didn't make any progress on this one. I didn't pick it up at all. Hopefully I'll get to it next month, but for now it's just sitting on my currently reading. Then I had The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This follows a young girl who has grown up with magic. She can see the household spirits where she lives. And the story starts when she's very young and you follow her over the years as Christianity is being introduced to her village. People stop praying to their household spirits, and that has made them more vulnerable to the evil surrounding them within the woods. I really enjoyed the story. I really like folktale inspired stories. I really liked the writing of this. It definitely felt like a modern fairy tale. Unfortunately, this means I've started another series because I did really enjoy this and I do want to finish the series, but I really liked it, so I can't really be mad about it. Then I had A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. This is the sequel to A Game of Thrones. I did read this book. I did enjoy it. I didn't like it as much as A Game of Thrones, mostly because some of the point of view characters from the first book are not point of view characters in this one, and some of the new point of view characters I didn't like. So that definitely affects enjoyment, how many of the characters whose perspectives you're seeing you like. I liked a lot more of the perspectives we had in A Game of Thrones versus A Clash of Kings. I am still really enjoying the world and the majority of the characters, so I'm definitely continuing with this series. I definitely enjoyed this book, just not quite as much as the first one. Then I had The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I did read this one. It was fine. I didn't particularly like it. I get why people like it. I can see why it appeals to people. But Becky Chambers' writing is very direct in the theme. It's very hand-holdy in telling you what it wants to tell you. And that's just generally not the style of writing that I enjoy. I like a little more nuance. I like to be kind of left to figure things out, even if there's a moment where the theme is stated. It feels like Becky Chambers really drives it in. The story is just a way to give you the theme. It's not, the theme isn't just a part of the story serves to show you the theme. And on top of that, I'm already pretty familiar with a lot of sci-fi things, and I don't feel like this story did anything new within the genre, to the point where a lot of the things felt too familiar. They felt too much like things I had seen before, and it made it feel like fan fiction to me, because nothing about it felt very new. A lot of the characters felt very familiar. A lot of the plot points felt like they were from other things. So I think if you don't have a strong sci-fi background and you like cozier stories, this would probably work very well for someone else. But for me, it just had too many things that I've already seen before, written in a style that typically doesn't work that well for me. So then I had The Unspoken Name. This one I read about 25% of, and then I DNF'd it. I just never felt very connected to the main character. I wasn't really invested in what was going on. It felt like from the moment we meet our main character until the plot really kicks off, it just felt like something was missing. It sort of felt like everything was kind of glossed over, and I don't know exactly what else I wanted out of it, but I just wasn't clicking with the story, so I ended up giving up on it. It's too long of a book for me to just truck through it and hope it gets better. So I ended up setting it down. Kind of disappointing, but can't love them all. So that's everything for my TBR. I think I did pretty well. I read 5 of the 8 books. One of them I decided I'm just never going to read, so I'm going to call it 6. So I have 2 that I have started. I just need to finally prioritize and finish them. So outside of that, let's talk about the things that weren't on my TBR that I read. First one is Delicates by Brenna Thumler. This is the sequel to Sheets, which follows a teenage girl who is essentially running her family's laundry business, keeping her family afloat after the loss of her mother. A young boy who has recently passed away begins inhabiting the laundry business as a ghost, and they become unlikely friends in the first book. And then in the second book, we meet a new character who's kind of obsessed with ghosts. Everyone thinks she's really weird. She doesn't really have any friends. When this book started, I wasn't sure I was going to like it as much as Sheets, and then by the end of it, I absolutely loved it. It covers some pretty heavy topics, but in a very delicate way. Very sweet story, but also pretty heartbreaking. But I really enjoyed both of the books. Then I read Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe, which is the sequel to Before the Coffee Gets Cold. Very similar book, same cafe, We get 4 new characters that are going to make use of the cafe's services to travel in time to talk to someone for one last time. I'm really enjoying this series. I really like the writing, and I think it's a very thoughtful look at what people might do if they had the opportunity to talk to one person one last time, because you can only do this once. You only really have a few minutes, and you also can't change anything that's happened. So I think this book looks a lot more at what are people trying to get out of this. Since it won't change anything for some of them, it's a lot more difficult than they expected it to be. For some of them, they're not even really sure what they're trying to get out of it. They don't have a specific question in mind. They don't have a certain thing that they want to say to this person one last time. And I just think it's a really interesting, thoughtful look at what people might do if they had one more opportunity to talk to someone. I also read The Lost World by Michael Crichton. This is, of course, the sequel to Jurassic Park, in which Ian Malcolm goes to the other island site, which is inhabited by dinosaurs, and there, of course, are a lot of problems. It's very dangerous. He just wants to get off the island alive by the end of it. I really enjoyed this series. I had a lot of fun finally reading these books. And I'll probably check out some other Michael Crichton in the future, because these are the first books of his that I have read. I also need to find a new book with dinosaurs. Not a lot of dinosaurs around. And I read The Tea Dragon Festival. This is the sequel to The Tea Dragon Society. Kind of the prequel, I guess. We get to see the Tea Dragon Society members from the first book when they were younger. There are, of course, the tea dragons in it, as well as a new dragon character that we get to meet. I am really enjoying this series. I think it's really cute. I really like the art style. And it's just a fun little time with little tiny tea dragons. Then I read both The Garlic and the Vampire and The Garlic and the Witch. This is about a witch who has a garden, and to get herself some help, she has magically turned some of the vegetables into little tiny vegetable people so they can assist her in the garden growing more vegetables. And our main character in this is Garlic, who of course is a bulb of garlic, and she's very anxious and just trying to do her best, but not very confident in herself and her abilities. In Garlic and the Vampire, a vampire moves back into the house up on the mountain, and she gets volunteered to go and see what the vampire wants, and if he's dangerous, and if he is, to get rid of him, which is a very nerve-wracking undertaking for Garlic. And then in Garlic and the Witch takes place afterward, where the vegetables have started growing up a bit, and Garlic ends up doing an errand for the witch that created them. Just very cute, very lovely characters. Garlic is so anxious and sweet, and her best friend is Carrot, and these are just charming little stories. Then I read The Sapphire Altar by David Dalglish. This is a sequel to The Bladed Faith that came out this month. I really enjoyed this book even without reading the first book, which is not a thing I generally recommend, but it worked out very well. I really loved the writing. I liked the story. I loved the world. So that was a lot of fun to read. Then I read Grey Sister by Mark Lawrence. This is the sequel to Red Sister, which I read last year. That was one of my favorite reads of the year. And this continues the story of Nona. I think I liked Red Sister more than this one, but I still really enjoyed this one. I'm about to pick up the third and final book in the series, so I'm excited to see how this story ends. So that's everything I read in January. I read 12 books, kind of a weird mix of fantasy, sci-fi, and adorable graphic novels, but I had a lot of fun with everything. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.